Good evening, and thank you for coming. My name is James Ellers. I'm the Executive Director with Lake Champlain International. I want to thank the candidates, candidate Sue Minter, candidate Matt Dunne, candidate Phil Scott, candidate Peter Galbraith, and candidate Bruce Lisman. Our moderator tonight, Peter Hirschfeld from Vermont Public Radio. The folks from Cable Access, thank you very much for recording this so we can broadcast it throughout the primary season. And to my co-sponsoring organizations, the Vermont Rural Water Association, the Lake Champlain Regional Chamber of Commerce, the Linalac Foundation, Vermont Businesses for Social Responsibility, Vermont Council, Trout Unlimited, Vermont Conservation Voters, Rights and Democracy Vermont, Rural Vermont, and the Green Mountain Water Environment Association. And a special thank you to Professor Patricia Siplin of St. Michael's College, the chair of the Political Science Department, for helping to facilitate the event here tonight at the McCarthy Arts Center. What I think is most notable is the broad coalition of organizations that came together to host this event tonight. And what you're going to see shortly are questions that we formed as a group that shows the unity among Vermonters regarding the priority that is water. It's cliche to the point because we do take it for granted. But water is absolutely fundamental to our way of life, to a sustainable Vermont and a sustainable economy. And as an executive director, the executive director of Lake Champlain International, an honor and a privilege that I do have, I'm extremely grateful that for the first time ever, we have all 5 candidates seeking to represent Vermont in its highest office, willing to acknowledge the importance of water to not just our environment, but to our economy. And with that, I think most of you probably know, and that's why you're here, just how important water is and the threats that we're facing. There's been some 11 million gallons of sewage, untreated sewage, gutter water, storm water with that pathogens and viruses sent into our rivers and into our lakes. We have hundreds of millions of dollars in infrastructure needs. We have cyanobacteria outbreaks in many of our communities, and with those come neurotoxins and liver toxins, and that's not to mention the habitat loss and the detriments to our fish and our wildlife and the impacts that has on our tourism economy. So I didn't come, you didn't come to hear me talk tonight. I'm going to turn it over to Peter Hirschfeld from Vermont Public Radio. I really appreciate your willingness to do this. Peter is most comfortable behind the radio. As you can tell, he has a face made for radio. So he's very nervous about television tonight, so please go gentle on him.
Thank you, James, for that introduction. And thanks to all the organizations that were a part of putting this event together. The next governor of the state of Vermont is sitting on this stage tonight. That person will have perhaps more sway than anybody else over the way this state goes about addressing the pollution issues that threaten our waters. And that makes your answers to these questions tonight incredibly important to the people that came here to watch you tonight. The campaigns were provided with copies of these questions in advance. As James said, enormous time and effort went into crafting those questions, and their careful wording comes from the decades of expertise and knowledge from the people running the organizations that crafted them. And it's our hope that the candidates will answer them as precisely and concretely as they're able, so that the people here tonight have the clearest sense possible of the path your administration would pursue when it comes to addressing water quality in the state. The format is a relatively straightforward one. I'm going to be asking the same question of each candidate in each round. They'll have 2 minutes, up to 2 minutes to respond. You don't have to use the entire time allotted. We have a star timekeeper down here in the front row who will notify you when you have 30 seconds left. And again, when your time has elapsed, we're under a tight time frame here tonight, and so I appreciate in advance your adherence to the 2-minute limit. We're going to start with the first question with the candidate nearest me. We'll move down the line. We'll move in similar fashion in the subsequent rounds, except for the second one. We'll start with the second candidate. Third question, start with the third candidate, and so on and so forth. Any questions from the candidates? Great. This first question is from Lake Champlain International. Members of that organization want to know, how do you define a clean water economy, and how will your administration help us achieve it?
So I will just say that clean water is really the essence of life, the basic needs for all of us, not just for human health and all of the species on Earth, especially our aquatic species, but also here in Vermont, very much a part of our recreational tourism and the health of our drinking water and our communities. So for me, it is about understanding that water connects us, that clean water is essential to all of us and our habitat, and that it will be my job as the next governor to really make sure we are understanding the impact to not just our drinking water, but our surface waters, our groundwater, and understanding the connection between all of our waters, our human health, our economic health, our environmental health, but also our economic prosperity. And it is key to be able to connect all of these. And I know personally the connection that I have in my life, whether it's canoeing and camping on the Green River Reservoir as I do every year with my family, and how critical our recreation resource is in parks and water bodies all over this state. Or whether I know, as I did, when we had 15 inches of rain overnight with Tropical Storm Irene, and I was put in charge of responding to that extreme precipitation and the erosion impact that that flooding had and the risks it had. Water connects us. Water is critical to our economy and our human health, our way of life, and it is going to be our job to make sure for the next generation they receive what we have been given, a beautiful state with terrific recreation and opportunity and wonderful communities, and that's my commitment as your next governor.
Matt Dunne, how do you define a clean water economy, and how will your administration help us achieve it?
Great. So thank you all for being here and being a part of this discussion. A clean water economy is, in fact, in many ways, the essence of the Vermont economy. And that essence and that reputation that we have is actually under serious threat right now. And it's brought this issue to the surface in ways that, frankly, we have not seen in probably 40 or 50 years since the EPA was created. And we need to be absolutely vigilant, particularly as a state. Because when people are concerned about whether there is a carcinogen in their water in the southwestern part of the state, or when that comes out into the public and suddenly, oh yes, there's problems in Bradford and in other areas, people start to question the place that they have come to know as a state that believes in the environment and that believes in making sure that there is a healthy environment for them to live in. But it's also about our brand, both nationally and globally, where when we have the EPA come and tell us that we are not even meeting their standard, we have a real problem. And we need to make sure that we are addressing it quickly and comprehensively. And in my first 6 months as governor, we will take on that task. Now, the economy itself around water can fit into a few categories. It can fit into recreation, which I think we all associate with it. But it also fits into sustainable agriculture, our reputation for sustainable agriculture and clean food. It's also, though, around innovation. And when you take the capacity that is in the Eco Center at UVM, at St. Mike's, at Champlain College, and at Vermont Law School, we actually can be a center of innovation in solving our water challenges here in the lake and here in our state. And just like Efficiency Vermont, take those innovations to do right by our state and be able to create jobs and a stronger economy by exporting that knowledge and skill. And that's where I think the opportunity comes in doing this right and doing it quickly.
Candidate Phil Scott, same question.
Thank you all for coming tonight, and thank you for having us here. For me, this election is all about the economy, and certainly a basic need of any entity, any state is about clean water. And I think it's an attractive quality that we've enjoyed for a number of years. We have a reputation for being a pristine state, but we need to protect that. And I think we have fallen down in that regard over the years. We have a lot of deferred maintenance in a lot of different areas, whether it's with our water systems, whether it's with our lake. We just haven't kept up. And I think that that's something that is really important to us as a state over the next few years. If we want to have both a thriving economy and be able to protect our citizens, we're going to have to find that balance, and we have to catch up. We have a number of areas. We look at our infrastructure, for instance, our transportation infrastructure. We have some problems there, deferred maintenance, things we haven't kept up with. We have water supply issues that we haven't kept up with. You look at Rutland, for instance, and we have a 100 to 200-year-old water system there that's failing and has fallen into disregard and disrepair. So for us, again, we're not going to be able to fix this overnight, but we have to be vigilant, we have to be diligent, we have to pay attention, and again, from my standpoint, it's going to take innovation, it's going to take listening to one another, balance, prioritization, and making sure that we're putting our precious resources, our limited resources, in the right area, and make sure we prioritize that as something that is important to each and every one of us and our economy.
Candidate Peter Galbraith.
Well, seated as I am between my two Republican friends, what we often hear from the Republican Party is, why would anybody want to open a business in the state of Vermont? After all, it has lots of regulations, and it has very high taxes. And the answer is, it's a great place to live. When Watson came to open IBM, he wasn't doing it because of the cheap labor or the low taxes. It's because he loved the state of Vermont. And what makes the state of Vermont great? Well, it is all those environmental regulations that protect the quality of life, as well as the taxes that pay for the quality public services. And so when we think about water as an economic issue and part of the broader environmental issue, it is really linked to the quality of life in our state. And that is why, if we are going to protect the quality of life, protect our water, which is critical for wildlife, for recreation, for agriculture, for tourism, then we need to not only maintain the regulations, but where they are insufficient, we need to strengthen them. And then we cannot talk about cleaning up our water system and then say, well, we aren't going to devote any additional resources. The truth is, it requires resources. And I'm proud of my own record on this. I introduced the first bill in the Vermont Senate to ban hydraulic fracking because of the danger that it had. And I'm pleased to say that that initiative became law. Vermont became the first state in the country to ban fracking. And I sat on the Natural Resources Committee and participated in the legislation to protect our lake shores. We had the weakest lakeshore protection of any state in New England and the lowest quality, and we haven't corrected that, but we've at least taken a step with buffer zones to try to protect our lake shores.
Candidate Bruce Lisman, how do you define a clean water economy, and how will your administration help us achieve it?
Yeah, good evening, everybody, and thanks for hosting this. James and other sponsors are doing a real service to our economy, but also to water itself. I'm taking a slightly different tack on this. Rather than speak of the water economy, I would say that let's clean our water. Let's maintain the best of what we've got and do our best to protect what we have. I look at it this way. You know, I grew up in Burlington. It was a difficult place to get to the lake. You had to cross tracks and jump a fence if you were in Burlington itself, and otherwise it was one beach at the north end, which was a long walk along the tracks. The lake is big and open, and but underutilized, and in some cases for some good reasons. One reason why there are conferences like this and efforts to call it, is it a human right or is it a part of an economy, is because there must be some reason we say that for 30 years, even as we've watched water quality degrade in our state, or Lake Champlain in particular become visibly less attractive and thus more dangerous, why nothing has happened. EPA has laws, and they're active in and out of cycles. We passed laws in the legislature, and governors going all the way back to Snelling 2 focused on the lake. But the fact is, one reason why we're here is that hardly anything has been done. Lots of meetings, lots of discussions, lots of groups focusing on it. But I think what I would do as governor is change the direction of this conversation, make it simpler to understand, draw a bigger coalition. Doesn't require either campaign slogans, just the nature of water itself, that we want it clean, and develop a program in a straightforward fashion to build a coalition to do just that.
Question number 2 tonight comes from Vermont Businesses for Social Responsibility and Rights and Democracy of Vermont. They want to know, candidate Dunne, do you think clean water is a basic human right? If yes, is government delivering on that right? And if no, please elaborate on why you don't think that clean water is a basic human right.
Sure. So I do believe that water is a basic human right, and it actually comes pretty naturally since over half of us is made of water. And I think we all sort of understand that at a general level, but the moments when you really understand that water is a human right is when suddenly you don't have access to it. And those are moments of awakenings. And in other parts of the world, this happens very, very frequently. But it does happen here, even in Vermont. I had the experience in my hometown of Heartland of a gasoline truck tipping over, MBTE getting into our water system, and for over a year, the people in the village of Heartland Three Corners and at the school, where we did not have a municipal water system, not knowing whether they were going to actually get clean water back for their homes. And we saw the same in Bennington, where the PFOA got into the system, a carcinogen that we have known for decades is both dangerous to people, but also incredibly fast-moving as it gets into water systems and can move across the way. And I'll tell you, the people in Bennington know that water is a human right. And what we have is an obligation as a government to make sure that people have access to clean water. And that's why I made it very clear when the evidence came out in Bennington that we should not wait for the lawsuits. We have to make sure that there is the infrastructure built. It is built now to make sure that they have access to clean water. They don't fear for the values of their homes, and they don't fear for their children. And we need to have testing throughout the state on demand so people know what is in their water that they and their children are drinking. And that's the responsibility, in my opinion, of the community, of the state, to be able to do that and do that quickly, figure out the lawsuits, get the money, go after it hard, but we have to regulate up front, give awareness and knowledge to people right away, and then make sure we're covering that cost for infrastructure.
Candidate Scott, do you think that clean water is a basic human right? And if so, is government delivering on that right?
It's not only a basic right, it's a basic need, and we all count on it for so many different things. I'd like to address a little bit on the Bennington issue. I don't always agree with the Champlain administration, but I want to give credit where credit's due. They did go in and they took action, appropriate action, to address this issue as it unfolded. It's an issue that affected the private wells of many people in that area. And I think that reacting appropriately now, looking forward, as Matt had said, to try and take care of Bennington is important. It's important to us as a state, and we won't fail in that regard. We'll assist them in any way we can to give them that basic need. In doing so, it might take a municipal water system that isn't something that happens overnight. And in fact, I went to the Institutions Committee this legislative session and testified to that fact, that you're going to have to plan accordingly. You're going to have to engineer this. Let's not wait until the next legislative session. Let's make sure that there's some language, some money, and resources to tackle this problem. So those are the types of things that a government has to do. Protect its citizens. Public safety is a paramount in any state, in any government. And I think in this regard, we've acted appropriately, and I think the Champlain administration deserves some credit for that. But there are other things that we can do. Again, we have to be proactive, prioritize, make sure that we're taking care of those that need our help. And again, in regards to that region, I think we've done that, but there are other areas of Vermont that have water systems that need our help as well.
Candidate Galbraith, same question.
Yes, I believe that a clean environment and clean water is a basic human right. And in 2011, I introduced a constitutional amendment to the Vermont Constitution that would have made clean water, the right to clean water, a part of the Bill of Rights of our Constitution. So I strongly believe that that's the case. But clean water is not just about drinking water, although drinking water is very important. And I echo what Phil Scott says about the Champlain administration's response to the PFOA crisis in Bennington. I think the state did respond swiftly, and the state will have to be there to respond to crises. But we need to treat the problem systemically. Yes, it's about the safety of drinking water, and I must say I was disturbed that the governor had actually earlier vetoed a bill that would have required testing of wells when a house was sold, because I think that's a pretty basic precaution. But more broadly, it's about our entire ecosystem. I mean, the water in Beaver Lakes may not be drinking water, but it needs to be clean water for the wildlife that is an important part of our state's ecosystem. And it includes the lakes. They need to be clean. Again, not all of them are going to be there for drinking, but for the recreational use that is part of the economy and that is part of the quality of life. So yes, it is a fundamental human right, but it's not just drinking water, it's an entire system.
Candidate Lisman.
I'd urge us to use less political language. So it may be a human right, but this is a 30-year wait to get action on cleaning both surface water and groundwater, as well as dealing with infrastructure. And one reason why we talk in these terms is because it's been so hard to get to an action plan. We have more meetings about what to do than we do actually doing something. This is a moment where I think there is a coalition that's formed up. And rather than fall into Flint or Toledo language, or even needing to talk about whether it's a basic human right, listen, let's be clear. We're all here because we care deeply about our environment. I have been arguing for some time that what makes Vermont special is, in fact, the environment we can see, feel, and live through and live in. And it involves water. I really believe this is a moment for an action plan and time to get to work. For one thing, the EPA is outside the door on matters of Lake Champlain and soon enough the Connecticut River. But the truth is we're all ready for it. We don't need to talk in big terms. And when given the opportunity, I would say all those meetings that I've attended that have those acronyms are largely exclusionary, not for civilians, not for the people who live next to a lake or a river or a pond. And so we need to simplify our language about this and simply say, let's get an action plan, let's prioritize, and let's go do it. Thank you.
And if somebody, quick follow-up, somebody twisted your arm and said, hey, you have to tell us whether or not you think clean water is a basic human right, would you be able to answer them?
Again, I think it is, but I'd rather say this. If we start using phraseology like that, it gets in the way of building an important coalition. For people who hear that, they say, well, what does that mean to me and what might I lose? Rather than do that, and rather than have a shoreline protection bill, which had fantastic features built into it, but ultimately resulted in lots of people opposing it because of the way in which it was introduced, I'd say language is important. I think this is a moment for action. I don't think we need phraseology that makes some feel like they're not part of that coalition. And so I'll say, yes, but if we use that and other things like it, we'll have a hard time sustaining a coalition.
Candidate Minter, same question.
Want to repeat the question?
Do you think clean water is a basic human right? And if so, do you think that government is delivering on that right?
Yes, I do believe clean water is a basic human right, and I think it's really our collective responsibility to sustain that right. And I would say no, we really aren't living up to our obligations in that regard. Not if you talk to the folks in North Bennington or Pownell or on St. Albans Bay or Lake Carmi. We have huge challenges to address. And I did go visit the folks in North Bennington, held a community session, met with community leaders, went door knocking to talk with people who had poisoned drinking water and to understand how that felt, to not know what you have been drinking for quite a period of time, a matter of decades. And frankly, it was very upsetting. I was in a restaurant and talked with a fellow from Hoosick, New York. Now in Vermont, we let people know as soon as the information was known. But in New York, not the case. And this man, he couldn't even find a mortgage on his home, which had meant everything to him. So I'm really proud to be a Vermonter. And I really will say we will not leave any Vermonter behind. We will move forward on extending the Bennington municipal water system to North Bennington so that they can be assured of safe drinking water. We will continue to test. And right shortly after I was in Bennington, I released, and I'm the only candidate to release, a clean water plan, which is focused not only on drinking water and wastewater infrastructure investments, but also on implementation of our clean water bill to clean up Lake Champlain and the other water bodies of the state. This is critical work that must be done, and we are at a really important time of change and a time when people have been coming together. And this is going to be a top priority of the next governor to implement these plans.
We'll begin this next round with you, candidate Scott, and this question is a little bit longer, so please bear with me. It comes from the folks at the Green Mountain Water Environment Association. When many of Vermont's wastewater treatment plants were built in the 1970s around the passage of the Clean Water Act, the construction was backed by federal funding that largely is not available anymore. As cities and towns face the need for maintenance and improvements to the tune of millions of dollars, who should fit the bill for these renovations? And what specific revenue sources should be used to pay for it? The association is also concerned about aging drinking water infrastructure and also want to know if you'd be prepared to invest money into those systems, and if so, where that money would come from.
Well, again, I think we're getting back to the issue that's at hand. When we look at the state overall, we have a population that's stagnant, 620,000 people. We're aging. We're not doing well economically. I think we need to have more focus on the economy and trying to rebuild and restore a thriving economy to Vermont so that we can pay for some of these things. We have a lot of deferred maintenance throughout Vermont in different areas. I mentioned transportation infrastructure. That happened 20 years ago, 30 years ago, when we were taking in money out of the transportation fund for other purposes. So every year there was $50 million taken out for maybe 20 years. And so $1 billion was taken out of that fund for other purposes. So we get sidetracked a lot of times. And I think that in the capital bill, I was chair of the institutions committee. We have money, revolving loan fund for water supply projects. but we also have some money available from the federal government. I believe that there will be more federal dollars available for water and sewer. But I think the one issue that we should really tackle when it's just is something that's somewhat offensive when you think about it. We need to really prioritize and look for where do we get the biggest bang for the buck. And when we look at what we've been doing, what's happening in some of our municipal sewage treatment plants, we're spending an enormous amount of money to take away a little bit of phosphorus in some of those treatment plants. And what we should be doing is utilizing those precious resources to get a bigger bang for the buck in terms of some of the non-point sources and so forth. So I would advocate storage during large storm events is something when they open up the gates and let the raw sewage go into the rivers is something that should be taken care of sooner rather than later. That's low-hanging fruit as far as I'm concerned.
And very quickly, any specific revenue sources that you
Capital bill could be utilized. I think revolving loan funds. I think federal government will step up. I think this is an issue that we're facing throughout the country. So I think we're going to have to utilize all the resources at hand to take care of the problem that's we're facing right now.
Candidate Galbraith, as towns and cities face the need for improvements of these infrastructures, would you support using money to pay for those more money to pay for those upgrades? And if so, what specific revenue sources would you use to pay for it?
Well, first, if we are going to wait for the Vermont economy to grow and its population to grow before we're going to address these problems, we're going to wait a very long time. The truth is, politicians have been promising to bring about new high-paying jobs and economic growth, and I've been through 25 election cycles in the state of Vermont, and I've been hearing these every election cycle, and it still hasn't happened, because if it was easy, it would have happened already. So if we have problems, we are going to have to find the resources to address them. We're going to have to find the resources to address them right now. And so to try to answer the question, we are the issue of how we deal with wastewater management, treatment facilities. This is going to have to be, and it is in part, the communities that have them. The state is going to have to play a helpful role. I wish I shared the optimism about what this Congress, the money that it would appropriate. Maybe there'll be a happy outcome nationwide in terms of the congressional election, so there'll be a more progressive-minded Congress next year that will be willing to come up with the money, but I don't think we can count on it. So we're going to have to look at our own resources, and that is going to have to mean, for long-term projects, bonding, but it's also going to have to mean making sure that we have adequate resources. And I actually have a program to try to provide additional resources by eliminating the special interest tax breaks and the corporate subsidies that are larding our tax code. There are millions and millions of dollars there for things that do nothing for our economy, but just simply go to the most well-off Vermonters. And I'll return to the subject.
Candidate Lisman.
Yes, well, in terms of infrastructure, there are 9 wastewater treatment plants that account for much of the problem. EPA estimated $155 million to basically upgrade and repair. There is our state treasurer, Beth Pierce, is hosting an effort to prioritize the budget, if you will, for all of that, and it comes to multiples of that. It's a very expensive proposition. Even small things like effective backups are proving problematic in some of the towns. Well, Phil and I agree. I think it's actually highly likely that a new Congress will rediscover water. And in fact, in 2014, they passed the Water Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Act, try to say that often, WIFIA, still being tweaked. It was rebuilt in 2015, and the EPA is working on new regulations today. So it's roughly a loan program that looks a lot like TIFIA, the program that was originally around for highways. So it's a a way to borrow money at below market rates. It offers potential. It's complicated. I spoke to two of you who know it well, and it'll have to be, if you will, cleansed so that it's actually usable. But I think that's the kind of money that's going to be available out of the feds. I think it's inevitable that we'll have to use some of our bond borrowing power to support infrastructure, whether it's underneath the streets of our cities or towns, or an effort to clean up Lake Champlain and some of the other rivers and lakes. I think I'd also say the Clean Water Bill has been shortchanged. The Clean Water Fund has been shortchanged, and I would change priorities. It now is the smallest benefactor, and changing priorities with the Vermont Conservation Board would be probably a good thing. So there's no doubt about it that we're going to have to prioritize where we spend our money. And in fact, I would say it's one of the 3 or 4 most important things we're going to have to be dealing with in the next 10 years.
Candidate Minter.
Yes, this question really is the central point to my clean water plan, which is we need to do a major investment throughout this state on both our municipal wastewater and drinking water. And I propose to do this through bonding, through clean water bonds. And I really take it from my experience, both in the legislature and as Secretary of Transportation, looking at a very similar challenge for our transportation infrastructure, which again was really built by the generation that preceded us, that we have not maintained, and it is our obligation in this generation to rebuild and modernize. When I was in the Transportation Committee in the State House, I learned with our committee that 20% of our bridges were structurally deficient. We spent 3 years educating constituents and our colleagues and came up together with a bipartisan approach, unanimously supported a transportation infrastructure bond fund. So we have been investing in our bridges, and we've been innovating. And that 20% structurally deficient bridges is now just 7%. We've come from the very bottom of the country, second from the worst, to among the top 5 in the country. Why? Because we invested and we innovated. This is exactly what we need to do with wastewater and municipal drinking water, and now is the time. Interest rates will not get lower. Now is our time to use the capacity we have in our bonding authority to invest in clean water and to innovate. You know, there are great decentralized wastewater system innovations happening all the time. We don't have to just do what we've always done. We can think differently about how we continue our growth, our smart growth in compact villages and downtowns. Because this kind of investment will also stimulate economic development and growth, just as it has in Barrie and St. Albans, where public investment in infrastructure has yielded significant investment from the private sector. We can do this, and we have to, and I will as your governor.
And Candidate Dunne.
So at the premise, or the start of this question, it said that the infrastructure was built in the 70s. And I wish that much of the infrastructure was built in the 70s. In fact, as the stories have come out, that hollowed out logs are serving our people, their water, and the wastewater systems. But also, it's a little bit personal. My great-grandfather was the first water and sewer commissioner of Newport. And I was up there a little bit ago, and they said, "Oh yeah, George, we still got the same pipes." And I said, "Oh, that's very funny." And they said, "No, it's not funny. They're the same pipes." Because the fact is, we've gotten behind on our basic infrastructure that a generation 100 years ago knew was necessary to be able to grow our state and do right by our communities. And it is our time now to make that kind of once-in-a-century investment, to make sure that we have the infrastructure that is ready. Because if we do not, and we do not move quickly, the lake will die. And all of the economic development strategies you want to have out there do not matter if Vermont is the state with the dead lake and the dead Connecticut River. So we need to move quickly. And I believe that if there was ever a time to actually go above our bond cap, which we set a while ago to try to get our debt back into check, But if there was ever a time we were going to go above that bond cap on a plan to be able to deal with the TMDL and not put it on the backs of each individual community, now is that time. And I will go to the rating agencies and say, look, here's the plan, here's how it's going to be used, it has a long depreciation period, but we cannot allow this basic infrastructure to actually collapse. We can do that, we can do our part, as Vermonters have every 100 years or so, to make sure that it's ready for the next generation.
Before we, next question, we're going to begin with candidate Galbraith. This one comes from the Lake Champlain Regional Chamber of Commerce, and they ask, across Lake Champlain, pollution levels vary dramatically, and so do the sources of that pollution. Do you think cleanup funding should be collected proportionally based on who's doing the polluting, and what policy mechanism would you use to achieve a fair and accurate funding mix? If you don't think that a polluter's contribution should necessarily be proportional to its effect on our waterways, please explain why.
I think in all cases of water pollution, that the polluter should pay for the cleanup. Now, in some cases, that's not possible because the polluter is long gone or the polluter doesn't have the resources to pay for the cleanup. So what one does is to try, of course, if there's ongoing pollution, to take measures to stop it. And then if there is nobody to pay for it, then in my view, it becomes a broader responsibility to try to find the resources to pay for the cleanup. I mean, it doesn't fall, in my view, on the community, for example, where the polluter was, because it's the polluter, not the community. And again, I come back to the issue of resources. We have a tax code that is full of special interest tax breaks, and the legislature just keeps adding to them. And every time there's a special interest tax break, it is a tax increase on everybody else, or it is a resource that is denied. So this year, the legislature enacted an exemption from the sales tax for products that you buy on the cloud. If you go to Staples and get your word processing, you pay a sales tax. If you do it on the cloud, you don't. That cost $4 million this year. But we know that things are going to the cloud. It will be $8 million in a few years, and probably in 10 years it may be $50 million. What was the argument? Well, it was the lobbyists who dominate the culture in Montpelier. They came forward and they said, if Vermont gets rid of, it puts in an exemption, which the tax department had said they should pay, but if Vermont has an exemption on products that are sold on the cloud, we'll become a technology hub. Of course, those same lobbyists have been in every other state legislature making exactly that argument, and not everybody's going to be a technology hub. And this is just an example of a larger problem. If we're going to have the resources, we need to get rid of the special interest tax breaks and have a fair tax code.
Candidate Lisman, do you think cleanup funding should be collected proportionally based on who's doing the polluting? If so, how do you come up with a policy mechanism that achieves that fair and accurate mix? And if not, why not?
Yes, well, I think it's frankly too large a burden for most of the communities involved. It's frankly, as you begin to move toward what would it cost to clean Lake Champlain, which is where the question was, it seems at first blush to be even beyond the capacity of our state to do that. I don't know about you. When I was a kid and had just an awful lot of homework, in fact, so much homework, sometimes I'd say, you know what, it's too much homework, I'll just go to bed. Maybe it'll clear up tomorrow. And that has largely been the conversation on Lake Champlain for the last 25 years. Ed Kolodny was put in charge of the lake and clean and clear under Jim Douglas, no funding, frankly, no real support in the communities for it, divisive right to the end, a great guy, wasn't able to accomplish very much. I would propose focusing on one part of the lake, Missisquoi Basin, Pike River. And the reason why I say that for this question, Pete, is I think we need to show the people of Vermont that we can actually have some success. And by speaking of the magnitude of the problem and the sheer size of it and the shortage of time under which we should do it, what it does is convinces people we can't do it. I'm really at a point, having lived near the lake for a very long time, that I believe we need to get on with it. And there's a whole bunch of things we can do and prove it. After all, we've got the LIDAR, and we know those red dots are there that says it's a critical source area. We have the methodology to fix it. We could offer green-related bonds, offer farmers the opportunity to sell their land, especially in the riparian areas, for roughly market price, and enough left over to remediate the land. I think we could show progress by moving red dots to green dots for the people of Vermont to know that we are all in, but actually this time around the state can get this done. And I can't tell you how important it is to convince the people, not just those who live near the lake or businesses near the lake or communities depending upon the lake, but Vermonters, that we can clean a part of Lake Champlain that is not only highly visible, but it's really in terrible shape. And by doing that, we can talk about the Connecticut River, or Carmine, or Seymour, or 20 other bodies of water.
We've begun inching past the 2-minute threshold, and I just want to reiterate how important it is that we stay on course this evening, so thank you. Candidate Minter?
So I do believe that we should try to make polluters accountable, absolutely, but that we have to recognize also the many beneficiaries of this great resource, our clean water. And for me, the key to cleaning up Lake Champlain and paying for it is that we are all in, that we are many sectors of contributors to the problem, and everyone needs to be in on how do we solve it. Stormwater management is very diffuse, so we can't point to one sector. In fact, we shouldn't be pointing fingers, we should be working together. Whether it is our municipal wastewater systems, whether it is our agricultural inputs, whether it is our built environment, and in particular, our rural roads. All of these sectors are contributing and need to be part of the solution and funding that solution. And when we are all in, we will be able to gain resources from multiple sources. And that's really at the heart of Act 64, the Clean Water Act, that I have been involved with for the last 3 years in the depths of understanding how state government can work with municipalities and with partner organizations all around this state to move forward on making significant progress to meet the TMDL. It is an extraordinary opportunity and requirement of this next governor that they understand what it means to implement this act. I've been in the trenches. I've been working with municipalities across this state. I've been working with partner organizations. We led an effort to have the Transportation Agency and the Natural Resources Agency actually work together on a bi-weekly basis to understand how we can better regulate infrastructure on roads, on farms, and on built environments. It takes someone to understand the workings of government to be able to be ready on day one to implement this bill, which is critical to our future. I've been there, I understand, and I'm ready to go.
Candidate Dunne.
So there's a couple of things we need to focus on. One is pursuing polluters aggressively. And I'm actually delighted that the likely next Attorney General is T.J. Donovan, who will, I know, actually pursue polluters. Even if they've moved on, they've abandoned the land, we can go after them to the ends of the earth to make sure they do right by the environment that they spoiled. And we need to make that happen because that's where the resources should come from. The second piece, though, is understanding that we need to work collaboratively to solve these problems. And that means not only municipality by municipality, but state by state, and in fact, country to country. And what is going to be critical in the first 6 months is actually collaborating in the coalition that has come together between New York State and Canada to be able to come to an agreement on how to make sure we are taking pollutants of a variety of kinds out of our lakes and rivers. And it's going to take, since much of that pollution comes actually from the north, we need to make sure that we are working together across borders to bring together the kind of resources to actually take action and make sure that we are all contributing appropriately and proportionally. The other piece to this question, which I think is very important, is that when new development happens, we have to be vigilant in making sure that that development is done in a way that does not contribute to the problem and potentially makes it better. Not allowing for lots of impervious surfaces all over the place that contribute to stormwater, but in fact taking technologies, many of which have been developed here in Vermont, to make our infrastructure more green and do better by our lakes and streams. Because it's the non-point sources that we need to solve for, and that is road by road, building by building, and farmland by farmland. What I was most impressed by was that in a time when our lake was dying, they actually cut funding for buffers on ag land. It's the wrong direction. We need to make sure we're investing in making sure that we have the non-point source solutions funded.
And Candidate Scott.
I think the question gets to the complexity of the Lake Champlain pollution and cleanup strategies involved. And I want to go back a little bit to Clean and Clear under the Douglas administration. And I would counter that it did start to address the issues and address the problem that we face. There was a number, we put millions and millions of dollars into that with stormwater treatment strategies, sedimentation, and so forth. Was it enough money? Probably not. But it was a start, and I think that there was some good things that were done in that regard. In terms of polluters, we look at Bennington with the water supply issue there. And I think that that's a strategy that's working out. St. Gobain is stepping up to the plate and working in tandem with the state in that regard. I also think that we have to look at different strategies within our state. You know, if they're a direct polluter, that's one thing. But if we're looking at the entire farming community, that's quite another. We have a tradition in this state as part of the backbone of Vermont. And we have to work together in order to provide solutions. We need our farmers. We need it for all kinds of different reasons. We need to be self-sufficient, with some self-responsibility, as well as to understand that that's the nature of Vermont. So working with them, working on those types of strategies that will work for everyone is important to us. But again, going back to those solutions that would benefit the most, I think is in regards to those treatment plants and having storage capacity so that we don't dump raw sewage into our rivers and streams after every storm event.
We will begin this next round with candidate Lisman, and this question comes from Rural Vermont, an organization that represents farmers across this state. They ask, farms are a big part of Vermont's economy and an iconic part of the state's history and culture. As they're expected to comply with new water regulations, funding sources like the Working Lands Enterprise grants, for example, are shrinking. What specific policy changes would your administration implement to reduce farms' negative impacts on clean water? And how would you fund those policies?
Well, our farming industry is really innovative. I think they have already adapted and begun to change practices. Many of the larger farms are already there. I would recommend that you see several of them that are actually pristine, closed architecture start to finish. I think the Agriculture Department, Agency of Agriculture, will be enforcing rules. I think the medium-sized and large farms are all in. It's a tough business. Milk prices have declined sharply. Margins are down, many of them probably losing money. And so there's an opportunity on the one hand to offer them the opportunity to either put land in conservancy, riparian land in particular, those that are in critical source areas, or actually sell it, and then remediate those barriers. I think the farm industry itself is in pretty good shape, and the innovators are already underway. I had meetings with both Addison County farmers and Franklin County farmers 3 or 4 years ago, and I told them, and they asked my opinion, I said, people will be coming with torches and pitchforks unless you get ahead of the curve. The lake is an invaluable resource, but something we now, in an active way, are attempting to preserve and save. And my experience with them is they're all in. It doesn't mean that there aren't farmers who are going to have a hard time adapting or adjusting. And some, because of milk prices and other things, may actually leave the scene, which is too bad. On the other hand, we have a remarkably new, innovative farm community doing things differently and producing different kind of products. I guess I'm more sanguine about the ability of the dairy industry to adjust, as well as the creation of a new farm industry.
Candidate Minter, what specific policy forms would your administration use to reduce farms' impacts on clean water, and how would you fund those policies?
Well, we know that a well-managed farm is really essential to sustaining good soil health, reducing runoff, of course, producing healthy foods and wonderful milk and milk supplies, but also to keeping our water clean. And as governor, my focus will be to be a strong partner with farms, and large, medium, and small, to make sure they understand the new rules that are coming into effect. Last week, I was in the Northeast Kingdom doing a tour de farms, visiting the Food Venture Center, a fantastic collection of opportunities for small farmers to use their resources collectively to produce important Vermont brand products. I visited Jasper Hill Cheese and Pete's Greens. I then was in Windham County talking to the leaders of the food hub there. I heard a lot about the challenges of not just the state new rules that are coming into play as a result of Act 64, but also even more so the federal rules. And what farmers, large and small, need are technical assistance and support. Yes, our Agency of Ag will be regulating and enforcing, but they will also be supporting to make sure that the rules that are in place are done in a way that farmers can actually understand and implement them and gain some resources to sustain them. I had a great conversation with the UVM Extension. We have wonderful partners who are out there really trying to make the rules simple enough to actually help farmers succeed, which I know they want to do. Again, we are all in this together. Our farms, large, medium, small, dairy, food, they are essential to our rural economy and to Vermont's way of life. We will help support them, but make sure that they are maintaining their commitment to clean water quality as well.
Candidate Dunne.
Vermont is an innovation state, and it always has been. And right now, some of the most amazing innovation is happening in the area of agriculture. And it's happening by a new generation of farmers. In fact, if you want to go and see the largest collection of young people in the second oldest state in Vermont, you go to a NOFA conference. And in fact, what you see are people who are turning to the soil to find ways to make a living and to be able to raise a family in a way that matches their values. And they're doing great work. And what's interesting is that work is being funded with teeny tiny grants from things like the Sustainable Jobs Fund. That with a little bit of money to help someone get over a particular technical barrier, they're able to move into a profitable space and a sustainable space using the brand of Vermont and the movement that is happening across our country, much of which started here. I mean, it wasn't until we decided that we were going to move forward with labeling GE foods that suddenly a little company called Campbell's decided to follow suit. And that's because parents want to know what's in their food, and Vermont is perfectly positioned to use our brand and our sense of trust and our progressive efforts to be a part of that. But it means actually investing that small amount of money to get value out of the entire food chain, as well as other products that we're producing. Making sure that value is given to people all the way in wood products when they actually do sustainable wood products work. Same with agriculture. It's investing in the Innovation Center in Hardwick. It's investing in the centers where people collaborate to compete. I mean, there are people who are sharing balers in various parts of the state because they know they don't need it for themselves and they can work together to create a stronger agricultural sector but one that is actually based on sustainability, doing right by our environment, and building a new economy.
Candidate Scott.
Some significant resources are in place now, and I'd work with the newly formed Clean Water Fund Board to see if there's other strategies that could be utilized in the future, and to see how effective they are at this point. As been mentioned, I think agriculture has been one of the bright spots in our economy. Our economy is faltering, but that's been, again, one of the areas that we've seen some growth, and something that is something we should be proud of. But dairy is still really a major industry for Vermont, and something that we can't forget about, and we have to take care of. They've had our back for a number of decades, hundreds of years, and we shouldn't turn our back on them. We need to help some of the small farmers, I think, work our way through this. I think crop rotation, buffers, some of the manure storage pits that have been built over the last few decades have been important. That's been with some federal dollars as well. I think there are still federal dollars that could be leveraged to help us out in this regard. But one of the areas that I think is really, when we talk about new technology, is the biodigesters that are being contemplated in Franklin County. And I think that that's something that could be replicated in different parts of the state, where we actually utilize those for future development of our renewable energy, so to speak, and use that byproduct for our benefit. So I think there are a number of areas that we can still work through, and again, working in partnership in tandem with the agriculture community, I'm sure that we can work our way through this.
Candidate Galbraith.
I'm now the fifth person to comment, and I think in the Senate, as the debate went on, one often observed that everything had been said, but not everybody had said it. And so I'm not going to repeat the many fine points that have been made with which I agree. The question is about the resources that might be going to support agriculture. There are a couple of resources that I think are important. My triple great-grandfather was on the founding faculty of the College of Agriculture here in Burlington, now the University of Vermont. My father was who got his degree in animal husbandry, started his career as an agriculture economist. And I think one of the most important resources for farmers is education and agricultural extension services. And I think they are going to be key to making the compliance with the new water regulations work. And then just, the state has finite resources, but I think the Working Lands Enterprise grants are important, and I would want to sustain the funding for them.
Candidate Minter, we are back to you to begin on this question, which comes from Vermont conservation voters. They ask, many states and the federal government have so-called citizen suit provisions that allow citizens to act as private attorneys general and bring their own enforcement lawsuits. Should Vermont enact a citizen suit provision to allow private enforcement of our state's water quality laws?
Well, I think citizen engagement is really the cornerstone of our democracy and something that we must all hold dear. I have received my professional degree in planning with a focus on environmental policy and management, and learned a great deal about all of the federal laws of the 70s and 80s and the complicated elements of them. And I think one of the real changes and transformations of sort of policy around the environment post the Clean Water Act and Clean Air Act has been about citizen engagement and particularly public involvement. Now, most of the federal laws do enable citizen suit protection. But with the clean water law, because we in Vermont are delegated that authority, I think what we need to be understanding is state government cannot be everywhere, and it is up to citizens to help enforce those rules. I think we will need in our permitting processes to develop the opportunity for citizen input and response. So I actually believe that this is important in how we move forward on implementing our clean water law, because it really is up to all of us. No one can be everywhere at once. We need to be able to have readily accessible information, and state government, my government as your governor, will have to respond appropriately.
And just to be clear, is that a yes on supporting citizen suit provisions?
Yes, within the Clean Water Bill law, because we already have those for the other federally enforced law, the Clean Air Act and other ones.
Candidate Dunne, should the state enact a citizen suit provision that would allow private enforcement of the state's water quality laws?
So I want to be really clear. I'm not a candidate that's going to tell you exactly what you want to hear all the time. And I want to be very clear that I get concerned when Vermont heads down a path that leads to greater litigation across the board. And that's sort of where I start from as a starting point. That being said, if we are in a position where an individual's action is leading to the degradation of someone's clean water in a significant way, they need to be able to take appropriate action. And if that requires us to go to a place where that individual has the authority to be able to litigate as their own version of an attorney general taking action, then we need to go there. But I think we need to go down that road very, very carefully to make sure that we do not end up in the situation where we are finding ourselves in some parts of the state where lawsuits over things that are simply traditional parts of Vermont farming and activity could be compromised. And we have seen some evidence of that happening in some places. We've also seen abuses as factory farming comes in. So in the context of clean water and the ability of clean water, I do support this. But I would want to come at it in a very cautionary way because I do worry about there becoming a state that's filled with massive amounts of litigation between neighbors, and particularly between neighbors, some of whom are doing the suing only being in our state for brief periods of time.
Candidate Scott.
To answer directly, no, I don't think that this tool is necessary in Vermont for a number of reasons. One is that we've, in 2012, I believe, we strengthened some of the enforcement authority for the state, gave the A&R ticketing authority as well. And this strategy might be, and I realize we use this on the federal level, but this might be something that's amenable to in other states that don't have such a strong environmental ethic as we do. But I think that for some of the reasons that Matt laid out, I think this could be a tool that could be misused, and I think we have to be very careful in this regard. We have an agency, we have a state government, we have and local government that is working towards these same goals, and I think we have to have a little bit of faith and trust in them as well.
Candidate Galbraith.
Yes. Let me add, the first question, or the second question was whether clean water was a human right, and I mentioned that I had introduced an amendment to the Vermont Constitution that would have made the right to a clean environment, including air, water, and protection of forests and wildlife, a constitutional right. And one of the reasons that I did that was not just to make a statement about our values, but when you put it in the Constitution, you are creating a right of individuals, and therefore, implicitly, a right to enforce that through the legal system. And that's why I thought then, and I continue to think, it would be important to have a constitutional amendment, but perhaps that's one reason why it didn't advance in the legislature.
Candidate Lisman.
No. I think that's going to represent a chaotic version of trying to do our best, and I agree with the other candidates who have said there's a risk that some of those calls are simply opining about generally accepted practices that they don't like because possibly they're a neighbor or simply concerned. But we do have the ability to set up 800 numbers, and even anonymous calls can be made to the AG's office or the Agriculture office. I think what we need to do is have clear rules, clear ability to enforce those rules, and to respond to complaints, whether they prove to be accurate or not. And I think that'll go a long way toward restoring a coalition. When we do things like this, the presumption is that the government can't do it. The last 6 years have not been a good period for proving that. They haven't done a lot of things well. But I think a new governor with a new direction, frankly, can prove that it's capable of getting things done, including beginning the bigger process of cleaning the lake and starting in the Missisquoi and the Pike, but also in responding to citizens' complaints, whether they're real or imagined or maybes. And I think that's the better way.
Candidate Dunne, we will start with you for this next round. This question comes from the Lintelak Foundation. According to the Vermont Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets, the use of glyphosate went from 4,800 pounds in 2008 to about 33,000 pounds in 2013. That's a almost seven-fold increase. Glyphosate is a known possible carcinogen, and when applied with certain pesticides is known to cause animals to exhibit traits of both sexes. A recent study of male smallmouth bass in the Missisquoi River showed that more than half now carry eggs. How would your administration govern the use of glyphosate in Vermont?
So the first thing that my administration will be about is science and making sure that we are doing the research and on these kinds of issues, that if it's not being done at the federal level and the national level, we will do it here. And we can lead the country in making sure that we understand the implications of these kinds of pollutants on our natural environment and on the health of individuals. The second is that this really comes down to, at least the increase, as I understand it, the increased use of genetically modified seeds. Roundup-ready corn is now commonplace in many, many of our farms. And what Roundup-ready corn means is corn that can't be killed by Roundup, which gives me some concern to begin with, and it also means a practice of using Roundup at a much more aggressive level across the board. And when you get more Roundup being used, more Roundup goes into the water table and goes into the water system. And so I think we have to take a hard look at a state at what sustainable agriculture looks like, how we address it, and the implications that come from various practices across the board. I do believe we need to make sure that we have ample investment in the research to understand the implications of some of these carcinogens, and to be able to make sure that we understand the best way to reduce them while still supporting a vibrant agricultural community and sector in Vermont.
Candidate Scott, how would your administration govern the use of glyphosate in Vermont?
I would govern the use of glyphosate the same way that I would govern other environmental issues. I would, as was stated before, I would focus on the facts and the best known practices for the use of this Roundup type of pesticide. And I would want to work with scientists and experts in A&R to make sure that we had the partners with agriculture and other environmentalists as well to develop protocols for the use of this product. I agree that it sounds as though this is fairly alarming, the increased use, but it's something that we need to address, and we have to base it on science and make sure that we know what we're getting ourselves into before we start limiting the use or again, developing those protocols for the use of that product.
Candidate Galbraith.
So I would take the opposite approach from what has just been described. In Europe, the approach is to make sure that the product is safe before you use it. Here in the United States, the approach is we'll use it until we determine that it is unsafe. In the Senate, I introduced a bill to ban, for the time being, the use of neonicotinoids, which is a type of product that goes with seeds, and which is linked to the deaths of bees, which are an essential part of our ecosystem. There's a moratorium on their use in Europe because the science is not yet in. I want the science to be, I don't want to start with a product and then do the science. I want to do the science and then decide whether the product is safe. And that is exactly the approach that I would take toward Roundup, which is a herbicide, and which is, of course, as Matt says, being used with Roundup-ready, GMO-modified seeds. But let's make sure it is safe. Let's do the science and then determine it's safe. Let's not allow it and then do the science and later determine that it was unsafe. That is the way we do it. That is not the way I would do it as governor.
Candidate Lisman.
Yeah, well, we should do our best to limit any product that's dangerous to our environment, whether it was a dry cleaning store or a dairy farm or any other kind of business. I am no scientist, though I've made enough phone calls on this subject to satisfy me that I'll never be a scientist. I'm quite sure some of you know more about it than I do. Here's an example where good farm practices would probably limit the use of it, particularly near water or where it could leak into water. It also points out the value of having those from whether it's Agency of Agriculture or UVM Extension Service in helping farmers in particular to deal with weeds and other competitive growing products. And the answer is to do no damage. And the real answer is to be careful and be safe. And the best way to do that is the best advice we can get from A&R or from the agriculture or from our scientists, but to make sure that dairy farmers in particular, because they're using this around corn, are able to do this in a safe and practical way.
Candidate Minter.
Well, this question really reminds me that for me as a young person, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring was really a transformational book. And it is so sad to be here now with information like this and realizing that we haven't turned this corner at all. In fact, we are continuing to create more and more dangerous pesticides and toxics into our environment. And it is complicated, of course, because we need to make sure that we do more monitoring and perhaps go beyond the federal requirements around Roundup and consider making it a permittable, something that you need to have a permit for. I think we have to work in coalition with other states, frankly, to actually move the needle on this issue. I'm very concerned about what we're finding, not just in our farming practices and herbicides and pesticides, but as we know from the PFOA, there are 80,000 toxic substances in our environment today that are not regulated. As Peter points out, instead of testing these products before they are put on the market, we are finding out from the results after. Big questions, big challenges, but at a minimum, we must monitor these effects, push forward ahead of the federal requirements where and when we can, and best to do that in coalition with many others who are as concerned as we are about our health, the toxics in our environment, our long-term sustainability on our planet. Thanks.
Candidate Scott, we are going to begin our next round with you. This question comes from the Vermont Rural Water Association, and they want to know, in the first 6 months of your administration, what immediate steps would you take, and we're not talking about things that are happening right now, things that would happen new under your watch, that would reduce the flow of phosphorus into Lake Champlain?
Well, first of all, I would establish a team to evaluate these municipal water treatment systems that are overflowing in storm events. I think that that's, again, somewhat unacceptable. I think that there's ways to continue with stormwater and sewer separation projects, but also to provide some storage in some of these areas so we don't dump raw sewage into our streams that flow directly into Lake Champlain. I'd also evaluate and expedite the process and work being done on those digesters that are being contemplated in Franklin County. I would focus on Franklin County. I would focus on Addison County as well to see if we could build more of them, because I think that that's new technology, something that could be utilized throughout Vermont. But let's focus on those areas, those problematic areas first. And then third, I would review the Clean Water Trust Fund report and follow some of the recommendations that they will make in terms of what we can do in the future to clean up our lakes and streams.
Candidate Galbraith, what would we see in the first 6 months of your administration, things attributable exclusively to you, that would reduce the flow of phosphorus into Lake Champlain?
The first thing I'll do is to appoint a Secretary of A&R and a Secretary of Agriculture, and I will ask them to tell me what is it that is required to reduce drastically the flow of phosphorus into Lake Champlain, and what will it cost? And because the way that you ought to approach this problem is to say, what is it that would solve the problem? Now, it may not be possible to find the resources or the political will to do it, but if you start from not asking what it would take to solve the problem, you're never going to get there. So that is the first thing that I would do. The second thing that I would, and then I'll get the recommendations, and I will make a judgment of how far we can go, and I would like to go as far as possible to deal with this problem. The second thing I'll do, and this goes back to the previous question, is I will ask for a moratorium on some of these products, including neonicotinoids and Roundup, that are damaging our environment, not just the lake, but in the case of neonicotinoids, creatures that are critical to our broader ecosystem. Then I'm going to move forward and try in every way to strengthen education for farmers and agricultural extension services.
Candidate Lisman.
Yes, sometimes the long 30-year discussion about Lake Champlain desensitizes us to the problems of Lake Champlain, the endless meetings, all those organizations, UVM extension, the meetings with acronyms, which I've told you before, largely exclusionary for common citizens who simply care about the lake. So I'd like to just tell you what I would do, just action steps. Stop talking, let's do something. So I believe in talent, first of all. I believe that the best talent we can find are the people who should be running agencies and departments. Let's assume I can find those people. So in the first 6 months, I'd appoint one person to be responsible for the cleanup of the lake, so one person feels the responsibility and burden of it. It doesn't mean that there aren't 10, 50, or even 100 people or agencies involved in departments, but one person. So, if you will, the Clean and Clear Ed Kolodny experiment proved that if he didn't have full responsibility, he couldn't get it done. Second, we need a universal budget. How much will it actually cost? Not 150 versus 850, an actual budget of what it costs and where we're going to spend the money. Second, how are we going to raise the money? Almost every month there's a press release from somebody saying they received some money from USDA, and when you look at the number, it's $54,000 over 2 years. And so a real inventory of what money we have and where we're going to get it. I'd focus on the Northern Lake. I think it's solvable, but it's going to take a while, but we need to prove that we can solve it, or this coalition that's represented here will quickly fall apart. I would say there is money to raise in the bond market, performance-related bonds to offer dairy farmers in the Northern Lake the opportunity to sell land that's in a critical source area. And by the way, I would change that name to phosphate emission sites. Thus, we actually know what we're talking about. All this is to say, as I run out of time, that American Forests, of which I'm chairman, it's a nonprofit conservation unit, has a pilot program in the southern basin to plant basically 10 miles of trees on a riparian barrier. And that's all for $200,000. So I think that is a good pilot program for what we can do in the Northern Lake.
Candidate Minter.
Well, I have to say, we do not need a new review. We know the problem. We've had many recommendations, and now what we need is action. And that is exactly why the first press conference I had was to roll out a clean water plan, because we have to get moving. We have not been making enough progress, even though we've been working hard. We need to work on the municipal wastewater systems. We need to analyze which systems need the most upgrade the most quickly based on the degradation that they are contributing to the lakes. And we need the clean water bonds to help capitalize those investments, and quickly. So I will be working on that analysis in the first 6 months. But I will also be making sure that our team is ready to go with working with our municipalities, both on their wastewater systems and on their back roads, because we know that contributes to the problem. We have a whole system in place to help support municipal work on back roads. We then need to work with our development community to understand the impact of stormwater inputs into our impaired watersheds. We cannot delay, and we must be working with our agricultural economy, our farmers, our dairy farmers, our food farmers, large, medium, and small. I have been working on this issue in the trenches for the last 3 years. We don't need more studies or recommendations. We've got a plan. Now we need to implement it. And that's what I'm going to do as your governor. And I will tell you, I'm the only one on this stage that knows these details, knows the people in the bureaucracy that have to do it, have been working with the partners all over this state to make this work. And I am anxious to get ready and go.
Candidate Dunne.
I agree we need to get started. Frankly, we needed to get started a few years ago. We saw this coming. We've talked about it. I was there for Clean and Clear. Frankly, a lot of the money for Clean and Clear went into press releases and press conference, not actually doing the improvements that we needed, and we identified it back in the 2000s. What we need to get going on is actual investment and then building the coalition to get it done. First thing I'm going to do is put real money in the capital bill to address the TMDL requirements right away, not try to put it on the backs of the cities that will take years to be able to put those resources together. The second is to put together, as I mentioned at the beginning, an international coalition with Canada, along with New York and Vermont, coming together to articulate a clear plan of action where everyone in each of those jurisdictions is investing with clear benchmarks to know that we are actually succeeding on reducing phosphorus over time. The third is we need to do significant investment in non-point source. And that means making sure that all contractors or individuals that are doing improvements on new construction or new buildings or new development are using the state-of-the-art approaches to actually reduce the amount of phosphorus coming from stormwater runoff. But it also means working very closely with our farmers with the uncomfortable conversation that when you have lots and lots of manure on the banks of the river, you're going to get phosphorus in the lake. And we need to figure out how to work together to solve for that. The final piece is something that I have worked on, which may take a little more than the first 6 months, but we can get started, in my work at Google, where I've headed up community affairs, and part of that has been helping to do carbon offsets. And Google, as a carbon neutral company, set aside a lot of money to do methane destruction. And what we found was the opportunity to use resources from carbon offsets, from carbon neutral companies, to go in and make investments in methane digesters at large farms. We have the potential to aggregate all of our farms together to do those kinds of deals, to be able to get that capital in and actually lead the way on separating our waste, getting rid of methane for the good of our environment, and keeping phosphorus out of the lake.
We're now going to go to the audience for questions from you all, and James will go to the person who wrote the question. And
We selected the questions. There was a lot of overlap from your questions and questions that we knew had already been answered through the course of the evening. So selected the ones that were most unique. I'm going to bring you your own question so that you may ask it yourself. The first question is Heather Furman from Jericho.
Thanks, James, and thanks for everyone who is sponsoring and hosting this tonight, and thanks to the candidates for being here. So my question is around the role of nature in supporting clean water of Vermont, particularly our upland forests, our floodplain forests, and our wetlands. And my question is, with forests in Vermont in decline for the first time in over a century, what are your plans for investing in natural assets and forest land protection to provide the cost-effective solutions for addressing water quality?
And we are going to take 1 minute each with these audience questions, and we'll pick up where we left off with candidate Galbraith to start us off.
I'm glad you asked that question because it's an issue that is near and dear to my heart. In the Senate, I introduced a bill, S-100, that had 17 co-sponsors that sought to protect the contiguity of our forests because these are whole ecosystems. And if you have development that penetrates into the forest, you're damaging water systems, you're damaging wildlife habitats, and it's something that should either not occur or should occur very rarely. And so that was the purpose of the bill. As I said, it had 17 co-sponsors, but in the typical Montpelier fashion, there was one developer. He was a large campaign contributor personally and through his corporations, and incidentally, I've led the fight to ban corporate campaign contributions. And he was concerned that it would affect the expansion and development in his ski area in the north of the state. And so the bill was a study was substituted for the substance of the bill. But as governor, I'm going back to that issue.
Candidate Lisman.
Yeah, well, let me tell you, I'm chairman of the board of American Forests. It's the oldest citizens conservation group in America, started by, among others, Teddy Roosevelt. It has planted 50 million trees, 2.5 million last year, more this year. The type of tree and where the tree goes may be even more important. We planted 1 million jack pines in northern Michigan, and the Kirtland warbler has moved from nearly gone to past the Endangered Species Act because of that. And I visited recently a place where we planted 400,000 longleaf yellow pine, in that it literally will save one of the rarest woodpeckers in America. So, in fact, ecosystem is largely replenished by forests, along with those kind of things, rare plants are saved. And so I believe in it, but they have to be planted the right trees in the right places. And in some cases, we need to leave those roads, just need to repair those roads that are in the middle of forests.
Candidate Minter.
Thanks for the question. I think it's a really important one for us to be dealing with now, as we know so much of our forest is actually in private hands, and we have to be concerned about fragmentation of our forests and the impact, of course, to water quality, the topic today, but also to wildlife, and really to all of the quality of life values that we have in this great state. I think we need to actually turn this from not just focusing on conservation of our forestry, but on sustainability and the forest products industry. You know, we've had an incredible renaissance of local food economy, and it's incredible to see what's happening out of the farm to plate network. I want to develop a similar network for the forest products industry so we can have a collaboration and innovation and partnerships. Maybe it's forest to kitchen. I don't know. But it is such a compelling thing that has happened and so successful, and that's what we need to do to make sure we're doing sustainable harvest and secondary processing so we can sustain our economy and our forests.
Candidate Dunne.
Forest fragmentation is a really, really dangerous situation in our state, and in fact, all of northern New England, where we're seeing division of ecosystems across the board that are leading to the mass destruction of much of our wildlife. And my father was one of the co-founders of the Vermont Land Trust, and he and Darby Bradley and others got together in our kitchen to think about how we could work with private landowners to avoid the overdevelopment and development of our farm and forest land. But that work is not done. The other thing that I think is very clear right now is that when we did Act 250, we intended to also do Act 200, which was actually to do planning across the state of Vermont. And we never implemented it. We never went ahead and actually looked at the entire state as a unit. And so we actually should, and I think we have the time because of a number of pressures, to go back and create what Art Gibb meant to do in the first place, which was a true statewide plan to address these issues and others, and collaborate with our neighboring states, because the forests do not end at the river.
Candidate Scott.
As is the case with our dairy industry, I think our forest product industry is very important to our traditions as well. And with that, we need to balance what our needs are, as well as what the protection of our environment. I think the fragmentation issue is real and something that we should be paying attention to. I look back at some of the pictures of the State House, and if some of you have seen them 100, 150 years ago, you'll notice that there's nothing behind there, no forest whatsoever. So I think we've come a long ways, but it's something that we continue to have to pay attention to in order to preserve our ecostructure.
James, what do you have for us next?
The next question comes from Lori Smith of Waterbury.
Thank you to LCI for hosting this event, and thank you, candidates, for participating. My question is, many of Vermont's dams no longer serve any purpose in terms of hydroelectric generation and may be unsafe. However, some of these man-made reservoirs behind them are critically important to their communities. How would you balance these two realities?
Candidate Lisman, we'll start with you.
Thanks a lot, because that's a tough question. I'm not sure, but because I get it. So we may not need them, and they may be dangerous, and right behind them is an entire ecosystem that is entirely dependent on its existence. I think I'd rely upon a couple of things. One is science to tell me what's behind there, and the cost of changing that ecosystem, as well as taking, of course, the dam down. I think I've been part of another debate that involved a dam, and what I learned is from that debate that it is really complex. And what I thought was an easy answer for that, which was 25 or 30 years ago, proved to be wrong, and it was too superficial. And that debate took about 7 or 8 years to resolve, and a considerable amount of money to actually eliminate the dam when it eventually took place. So I respect your question. I wish I had a better answer. But I promise you I'd have the right people around me to give me the answer, and you.
Candidate Minter.
Great question. I have two issues that I want to talk about with dams, and the first is dam safety. And it's not something we talk about very much, but when you've looked behind the curtain of what's happening in some of our older dams, we have grave concerns, and we need to be thinking about that. But I don't want to just leave a dam or take down a dam. I want to use the dam whenever and wherever possible for electric generation. And I'm going to tell you about a micro hydro project that I visited in Bennington, North Bennington. Incredible. They turned what was a brownfield and an aging and perhaps dangerous dam into a micro hydro project that was cleaning up the contaminated soil, becoming not only a place generating electricity, but a new opportunity for a commercial and industrial use site. But the most important part to me wasn't just that it was creating electricity. They worked with Trout Unlimited to create fish passage as well. So we can innovate. We can create electricity. We can create new opportunities for economic development in some of these areas and continue to help sustain our fish aquatic life.
Candidate Dunne.
That dam project is actually quite extraordinary. And for anyone who's down in the Bennington area, it's worth going for the tour because it is about engineering for the future. And I was on the institutions committee when we went through the hundreds and hundreds of dams that we have across the state that the state is responsible for, because they sort of abdicate and they turn over for the state to have to deal with. And I think we have an opportunity to go through each and every one of them and to make a determination based on both science and opportunity to say which ones, and it's usually a small subset that could be used for electrical generation, but make sure we're using each of those. Go through and see which ones are actually critical to ecosystems that are behind it, and then where possible, actually remove those dams to allow for habitat to be able to flow appropriately. Because we're paying for the liability insurance and everything else on them, and they're not necessary. We just sort of talked about them and then we moved on, when in fact they're an asset that's out there ready to be addressed, and I'm delighted that you're bringing that up.
Candidate Scott.
Matt and I sat on the same institutions committee when we were debating some of those dams that are throughout Vermont, and it's not an easy issue. It's not as easy as it sounds. I can think of one, Curtis Pond in Washington County, that can't find out who is the owner of that dam at this point in time. So there's a liability factor. It is failing. It's something that needs some work. And there is an ecosystem behind it. So I think that it's not as easy as saying we're going to take some out and some not. It's case by case. The other issue, of course, is Morrisville with the Green River Reservoir. Morrisville Water and Light owns the generation system for that. And they're concerned right now because the water flow limits are being set at a different standard. They're not sure if they're going to be able to continue to produce hydro efficiently, electricity efficiently, and that's of great concern to them. And then what happens at that point? Do they stop utilizing the dam, and what happens to all the recreation, everything behind the Green River Reservoir at that point, and water storage and storm water and so forth, runoff in the spring. So it's a very complicated issue, not as easy as it might seem.
And Candidate Galbraith.
So in the Senate, I sat on the Natural Resources Committee, and we addressed the question of dams. So I guess it's a recurring question, and exactly what Phil said. There are dams you couldn't determine who actually owned them. And obviously this has to be dealt with, as has been said earlier, on a case-by-case basis. An unsafe dam is either going to have to be repaired to be made safe, or it's going to have to be removed. And that decision will depend on the ecosystem and the community needs, as well as any electricity generation. And to the extent that they can be removed where they no longer serve a purpose, that is obviously the best solution to restore the ecosystem. But again, case by case. As long as the subject is dams, I want to turn, though, to another topic, which is my hope that the state will acquire the dams on the Connecticut River, because these dams, the ecological damage of this important renewable energy source has already taken place. And if we acquire them, we could acquire 1/3 of our base load and go a long way toward our goal of 90% renewable by 2050.
Next question.
Peter, the next question comes from Dr. Stephen Handwerker of South Burlington.
Yes, first I want to thank everyone involved to put this event together. It's very helpful for us to understand exactly where we're going in Vermont. And the question I have is, I'd like to know what each of your legislative efforts have been, especially to involve corporations, because we often hear that the corporate influence is negative. I'd like to hear what your efforts are to involve corporations positively in terms of creating a better environment for Vermont. Thank you.
Candidate Minter, we will begin with you.
Can I just ask to clarify what legislative actions we have taken with corporations?
No.
With companies? I'm sorry, I didn't understand the question. Maybe you could repeat that.
It was a general question, which I think in some sense was answered, but of course I asked the question before the previous questions were asked. I was really asking for the, I guess, the historic legislative actions that were taken by each of you. What work have you done legislatively to promote the environment, actually?
Oh, to
rather than just
promote the environment.
Rather than what you plan to do. What did you do? And then also the second part of that is, how do you work with corporations to engage in a positive input rather than a negative one? Thank you.
Okay.
And as we're drawing to a close, I think it would be appropriate to just summarize what you've all answered throughout the numerous questions for those of you that have held legislative positions versus those of you that have been in the private sector.
Okay, so I have served in the legislature for 6 years, 4 years on the Transportation Committee, 2 years on the Appropriations Committee, and during my time on the Transportation Committee, I worked incredibly hard to make sure we were investing in bicycle and pedestrian facilities, investing also in our downtowns to create greater economic opportunity in our downtowns and revitalization in order to sustain our rural landscape. I worked on stopping bus idling. I worked on air quality issues relative to reducing our emissions from automobiles and improving access to alternatives to the automobile. But in terms of my work with companies, I have been working also as the deputy, then the Secretary of Transportation, collaborating all the time with companies about how we actually improve our imprint on the environment. After Irene, I was the Irene Recovery Officer. We worked incredibly hard to think about how we become more resilient in the design of our culverts and our bridges to reduce hazards, to reduce erosion, to protect our river ecosystem. Very innovative changes in terms of how we are utilizing our river science and working together with municipalities and road builders at the state level to actually think about how our investments in the built environment affect our river ecosystem. So that's just one of many examples.
Candidate Dunne, I know it's a lot to bite off in just 1 minute, but please do your best.
Sure. So just as a quick summary, worked on a lot of environmental issues, including getting mercury out of our rivers and streams, as well as when I was Vice Chair of Transportation, bringing more passenger rail to get more cars and trucks off the roads, both to the western side of the state as well as along this corridor. But the work that I actually, in many ways, am most proud of is the Land Recycling Act. And it was the first piece of legislation to actually address brownfields. And I think it gets entirely to your point. Because for a long time, we had millions of square feet of abandoned industrial sites that had some level of pollution that no one was touching because the liability was so deep. And so what we did is I worked with a group of Vermont Law School students. We looked for the best laws around that kind of work. And we passed a law, and then we improved it, and then we funded it to be able to make those industrial lands cleaner in partnership with the private sector, and now to become part of our working economy and taking the pressure off our farm and forest lands for development. That's the kind of thing that I'm very proud of, and I think we need to do more of in the future.
Candidate Scott.
My first 2 years in the legislature were on the Natural Resources Committee, and it was my first foray. I didn't understand politics all that well. And I maintained my independence, so to speak, and we forwarded mercury legislation that I was part of. In fact, saved it at the 11th hour, and I think at that point it was our chair was Senator Dick McCormick, and I think he can recount that that I probably saved that legislation. It probably wouldn't have happened in that year without my efforts. But also biomass projects in schools is something when I was on the Institutions Committee that I continued to work towards and created funding for that and incentives to do that, because without that help, I don't think we'd have as many throughout Vermont. Performance contracting in schools was another measure that was my initiative, and something that I'm proud of. I think it's something that works, trying to establish controls and so forth to get real conservation of some of the utility costs in schools and so forth. Weatherization is another area of, that I've worked on over the years.
Candidate Galbraith.
I served on the Natural Resources Committee and was part of the effort for the Shoreline Protection Bill as well as energy conservation and efficiency measures. But I'd like to talk about the bills that I myself initiated. First, the bill that made Vermont the first state in the union to ban fracking, and when I introduced it, Peter Hirschfeld, then writing for the Rutland Herald and Times Argus, wrote a front-page story on it, and that helped get a lot of attention and attract support. S-100, which I've talked about, it was the forest fragmentation bill, and it was going, a lot of bills have great titles and they don't do much. This would have done a huge amount. It basically would have made it very hard to develop anything more than 1/3 of a mile from an existing road. So it would have protected contiguous forests. the effort to ban neonicotinoids, to extend the bottle bill to non-carbonated beverages, which is more than half of our roadside litter, the effort to keep our renewable energy green, to prohibit the sale of RECs out of the state and then double counting that as renewable energy. So these are the initiatives that I undertook, and I'm very proud of that record.
Candidate Lisman.
I never served in the legislature. I've never worked for government. I've never run for an office before. I'm the definition of the outsider here. Let me just say that, again, American forests, it just happens to fit this topic today. In the riparian barrier plantings that we're doing, it was initiated by a company that offered up $150,000 if American Forests and others could find some matching funds. All it was another $50,000. It was I believe it's a privately held company. And so we're going to plant 25,000 trees, 10 miles long, and it's phosphates are locked into banks. If you can keep them there, we're okay, but as they wash out, it goes right to a lake or another river. So that's a project that has a great application elsewhere. But I think businesses in our state are environmentalists at heart, and I predict in the next 5 or 10 years we'll be talking about parking lots and how they're constructed and what's in them to slow the rate of water passage. And I think more and more we'll be asking our companies, our employers, to help us. And my guess is they'll be pretty enthusiastic.
And James, who are we going to for the last question of the night?
Our last question of the night, Peter, is from Trevian Stenger of Winooski.
Everybody, thank you. Thanks all for coming. I'll just say it's very much on us after we leave tonight, too, to keep pressing our candidates on this and keep talking about it and learning about it. And in that notion of that this shouldn't only be solved by experts, by legislators, but an active and engaged, ecologically informed citizenry is quite important here. I'm wondering what each of you pictures doing to help create and sustain a culture and an education of clean water. So how we might create this culture.
I couldn't hear that.
Sure. How you can help create and sustain a culture of clean water. How we might have an informed, well-educated citizenry around clean water. Thank you.
Candidate Dunne, are we?
Okay.
All right, candidate Dunne.
It's getting late. We're getting better at this, though, right? So thank you for the question. And I think actually not far from here is the starting point, which is the Eco Center, which is actually an incredible, incredible asset that I think has just scratched the surface of what we can do on education around water. And in fact, when I was at Google, we actually funded a 3-dimensional setup to allow for data to be displayed on the health of the lake in real time, and to allow engineers to be able to graphically display it for their own research, but also for young people. And the exciting thing about that space and the Monshire Museum down my way is that it is fun and active and all about that educational experience and exposure, so it becomes second nature to understand that the water is us and that we have a responsibility to protect it for the long term. Beyond that, I actually believe in service education. I was the head of AmeriCorps Vista, and I became a firm believer that you actually, as part of education, should be doing service in your community, in your natural resource. And that's the best way to, no pun intended, absorb the importance of the ecosystem around you. And I believe we can become the service learning leader in the country.
Candidate Scott.
I think it's an interesting question because we need to connect with those who are affected. I have a construction business 20 years ago when some of our employees were putting in like silt fence up and over high mountains and so forth. They could never figure out why it is that we're putting it in the highlands. Why is it that because they drew it on a piece of paper, that we had to do it? And they failed to see the relationship. And finally, it came to be that they they wanted to get engaged. They wanted to understand more about why is it that we want to prevent sedimentation into the streams. And most of them are, they love the outdoors, they hunt, they fish, and so forth. And we were able to bring the connection to them. In fact, enough so, I worked with Representative Dean in trying to go around the state and engaging with contractors and construction workers on the ground to actually make that relationship as to why is it as important to you as it is to us. And I think that, again, that gave a sense of engagement, involvement, and they were able to show where they could make some gains as well, where they could prevent sedimentation in different ways that engineers hadn't even considered. So there was buy-in from both sides, and I think that that communication was very, very helpful. And that's what we should do, engage people and have them understand how it affects them personally.
Peter Galbraith.
Well, I think this being the last question, I want to thank everybody here because I think you are part of what is creating a culture of clean water. And you know, the pressure from organizations here and people here is what's going to keep politicians focused on the issue. But I'm going to kind of conclude with a bit of a downer because I think we need to change the political culture. This is, after all, a political race. And it is a culture in Montpelier where the special interest triumphs too often over the public interest. In legislative committees in Vermont, lobbyists participate in the markup of legislation. In evil Washington, you have hearings, the public is heard, usually once, including the lobbyists, and then it's just the elected representatives who participate. But in Montpelier, some chairmen go around the back of the room, you know, and ask the lobbyists, are you happy with this amendment? Are you happy with this amendment? Are you happy with this amendment? And so inevitably, when you have that kind of system, those who have a particular interest, those who want to continue a particular pollution, those who want to build the West Bowl up at Jay Peak, they can triumph over the broader public interest. That's part of the culture that needs to be changed, along with the corporate campaign contributions that allow businessmen with interest before the state to evade the limits on how much you can give by giving many multiples to candidates using their different corporate entities, and they wield very significant influence.
Candidate Lisman.
Some people learn from seeing things, and so if any of you have been to the Missisquoi in July or early August, it looks bad, it smells bad, and you get an immediate sense of trouble ahead, a real sense of dread if you're around it. Some of us do things, whether you're fishing in one of the LCI fishing derbies or hunting, on passing through streams. Some of us like to hike and camp out. Gives us an opportunity to see streams, sometimes befouled. I told someone earlier, I was hiking at the age of 7 up the Missisquoi River, and I have not forgotten the scene. Someone had dumped cans of red paint in the river at a particularly low point. It's a small tributary into the river, and there must have been thousands of dead fish. Here were 4 or 5 kids of a certain age. We were stunned. We literally couldn't believe what we were seeing. And the adult with us stood there with us looking at the same disaster. Whatever it takes to tell people of the emergency, we should do it. See it, to hear it, talk about it, write about it, keep talking about it, but we need to get into action.
Candidate Minter.
Great question, and great concluding question. I think the answer is in our kids and our next generation. I volunteered in school each month doing an ELF program when the kids were little. I have such a vivid memory of being in primary school, and we took the whole day to go into a river and clean it up. And that's when I learned about pollution. I think it changed my life. I have such a memory of that. I've had great opportunities to do that with our kids in our school system. I think Green Up Day is an incredible education and we need a Clean Water Day. We need to bring our next generation and everyone they can to the lakes when the algae blooms are happening so that people understand what's going on. Until you see it, you cannot believe it. But I just want to conclude by saying it really is in all of our hands. Obviously, you are dedicated and passionate to this topic, and I thank you so much for being here, for the work you do in the various ways you do it, whether it's in your family, your community, or your organization, and for listening to all of us here on a beautiful evening. Thank you so much for this evening and for the work you do.
I'm going to hand it over to James to close out the program. Before I do, I want to thank again all the organizations that put this on. I want to thank the audience members that care enough about this topic to have come out tonight. And I want to thank the candidates for what I think were some illuminating answers on some critically important issues. So thank you all.
Peter, thank you very much. If we could give a round of applause to Peter Hirschfeld for his job tonight. And I did feel it was acceptable to make the face for radio joke, since you know I have a radio program and I don't have a TV show, so we're brothers. I would like to acknowledge the candidates. I have to say, first and foremost, I'm extremely proud to be a Vermonter. I can't tell you how proud I am to sit here listening to the articulate, well-informed, sincere responses, and how grateful that one of you will be our next governor, having acknowledged the importance of swimmable, drinkable, fishable water. Washington could learn a lot from what we've done here tonight. If we could give each one of these candidates a round of applause, I would appreciate that. Two thank yous to my staff, Juliana Dixon and John Hutchins, for your effort in putting this together. Thank you very much. It looks great and everything went smoothly. And to the Conservation Law Foundation, who was not a sponsoring organization, but who is an esteemed partner of ours, because while we're dealing with the executive branch tonight, sometimes the executive branch and the legislative branch don't always work. And that is why we do have a third branch of government, and we believe that the judicial branch is a very important part of that form of governance, and Conservation Law Foundation does an excellent job representing our interest, the public's interest, in clean water. And finally, thank you to each of you. Building stronger communities, keeping water clean, building an economy that protects water rather than poisons it is a team sport. And we need each one of you to go out and recruit somebody else to help in building this culture of clean water and helping our politicians create a clean water economy. I can't help but remember as a child watching Jacques Cousteau. We had 3 channels, and you had to get up and turn them. And so I had a lot of time to think about it in between going back and forth up to the channel and playing with the tin foil. There's no disconnecting the water cycle from the life cycle. And that's how I'd like to close tonight. And if any of you ever forget that, you call me, I'll remind you in the process of forming your policies and establishing your priorities. There is no disconnecting the water cycle from the life cycle. Thank you again, everyone. Best wishes in your campaigns. And please stay engaged. Swimmable, drinkable, fishable water, we're not going to do it without you. Have a great night.